The Mediterranean in the spring of 1941 was a theatre of desperate improvisation and strategic gambles. After the fall of Greece, the British Empire found itself backed into a corner, clinging to a rugged, mountainous island that served as the final gatekeeper to the Suez Canal. Crete was not merely a piece of territory, it was a stationary aircraft carrier of immense psychological and tactical value. To Winston Churchill, it was a fortress that had to be held at any cost to protect the lifeline of the British Empire. To Adolf Hitler, it was a nagging thorn in the side of his upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, a base from which British bombers could strike the vital oil fields of Ploiesti. The man who envisioned the capture of this island was General Kurt Student, the father of Germany's airborne forces. Student was a visionary who believed that the traditional constraints of geography could be bypassed through the air. He proposed a vertical envelopment of unprecedented scale, an operation that would rely entirely on the elite Fallschirmjäger. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were the ideological and physical vanguard of the Luftwaffe, trained to drop into the heart of enemy territory and hold the line until heavier forces arrived. But the plan, code-named Operation Mercury, was birthed in a cloud of institutional hubris. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, committed one of the most catastrophic blunders of the war. They estimated that the British presence on the island was negligible, perhaps a few thousand demoralized troops evacuated from the mainland. They assured Student that the Cretan population would welcome the Germans as liberators from British colonial rule. In reality, the island was defended by over 40,000 battle-hardened New Zealanders, Australians, and British regulars, supported by thousands of fiercely independent Greek soldiers. Even more critical was the invisible war being fought in the shadows of Bletchley Park. Through the ultra-intercepts, the British knew the exact date, time, and locations of the German landings. General Bernhard Freyberg, the commander of the Allied forces on Crete, held the German playbook in his hands days before the first parachute opened. The stage was set for a slaughter, yet the tragedy of Crete is that even with total foreknowledge, the defenders would find a way to let victory slip through their fingers. On the morning of May 20th, the silence over the Malem airfield was shattered by the low hum of hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. To the observers on the ground, the sky seemed to solidify into a mass of white and green silk. It was a sight of terrifying beauty, but for the German paratroopers dangling in their harnesses, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Unlike modern parachutes, the German RZ model forced the jumper to exit in a face-forward dive, leaving them nearly helpless and unable to steer during the long descent. As they drifted downward, they were met not by a welcoming population, but by a wall of lead. The New Zealanders of the 5th Brigade, entrenched on the heights of Hill 107, had a panoramic view of the drop zones. They did not wait for the Germans to land. They fired into the air, turning the sky into a killing field. Paratroopers were riddled with bullets before their boots ever touched the soil. Many fell into the tops of olive trees, where they were bayoneted while still struggling to free themselves from their cords. The German tactical doctrine added a layer of systemic failure to the physical carnage. The Fallschirmjäger jumped with only a handgun and grenades. Their primary infantry weapons were dropped separately in canisters marked with colored smoke. On Crete, these canisters often landed in gullies, deep ravines, or directly into the hands of the Allied defenders. This left hundreds of elite German soldiers wandering the rocky terrain armed with nothing but knives and pistols, hunted by New Zealand snipers and Cretan civilians who emerged from the hills with ancient flintlocks and kitchen knives. The first day of the invasion was a disaster for the German High Command. At Malem, Retimo, and Heraklion, the story was the same: high casualties and a failure to secure any of the vital airfields. The 7th Flieger Division, the pride of the Luftwaffe, was being bled white. Kurt Student, sitting in his command post at the Hotel Grande Bretagne in Athens, was in a state of near collapse as reports of the mounting death toll reached him. He had gambled the future of the German airborne arm on a single throw of the dice, and it appeared he had lost. Yet, in the fog of war, the greatest advantage can be negated by a single moment of hesitation. The hinge of the entire battle was Hill 107, the high ground overlooking the Malem airfield. The New Zealand commander in charge of the sector, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, was a Victoria Cross recipient, but the chaos of the German landings had severed his communications. Believing his battalions had been overrun and fearing his men would be cut off in the dark, he made the fateful decision to withdraw his forces under the cover of night. It was a catastrophic error of judgment. When the sun rose on the second day, the Germans were shocked to find the heights of Hill 107 abandoned. They crawled up the slopes, exhausted and depleted, and realized they now held the key to the island. With the height secured, they could bring the airfield under direct fire, but more importantly, they could finally begin landing reinforcements. The door had been left ajar, and the Germans would now kick it down with everything they had. Despite the loss of Hill 107, the German position remained precarious. The airfield at Malem was still under sporadic artillery fire and littered with the wreckage of crashed transport planes. The Luftwaffe pilots, showing a desperate bravery, began landing their Ju-52s directly onto the beach or into the middle of the debris-strewn runway. Each plane that successfully landed disgorged a fresh squad of mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, who were not hindered by the tactical limitations of the paratroopers. The British Navy, meanwhile, was winning the war at sea but losing the war against the air. Admiral Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet intercepted the German seaborne invasion flotillas, sending thousands of German soldiers to the bottom of the Aegean. But without air cover, the Royal Navy was defenseless against the relentless dive bombing of the Stukas. Ship after ship was sent to the bottom, including the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji. The price of denying the Germans the sea was becoming unsustainable, and the balance of power began to shift toward the land battle. On the ground, the nature of the fighting turned primal. The Cretan people, from teenage boys to elderly women, rose up in a spontaneous and ferocious resistance. They saw the invaders not as soldiers, but as violators of their ancestral home. This was a form of warfare the Germans were not prepared for. They expected a professional, gentlemanly surrender. Instead, they found themselves in a mountain war where every rock could hide a partisan. The brutality of the Cretan resistance would later be used by the German command to justify some of the most horrific reprisals of the Mediterranean campaign. The Allied leadership on the island began to suffer from a paralysis of initiative. While the rank-and-file soldiers fought with incredible tenacity, the higher command failed to launch the decisive counterattacks that could have swept the Germans back into the sea. There were moments when a single-spirited bayonet charge might have cleared the Malem airfield, but the orders never came, or they were delayed by the broken communication lines. The Germans, sensing the Allied hesitation, pushed forward with a ruthless focus, consolidating their hold on the western end of the island. As the German perimeter expanded, the Allied position became a series of isolated pockets. The heat, the lack of water, and the constant screaming of the Stukas began to wear down the morale of the defenders. The retreat across the White Mountains began, a grueling march toward the southern coast where the Royal Navy waited to evacuate what was left of the garrison. It was a journey of immense suffering, as thousands of men scrambled over razor-sharp limestone paths, pursued by the relentless Gebirgsjäger who were in their natural element in the high peaks. The evacuation at Sfakia was a scene of controlled desperation. Just as they had at Dunkirk and in mainland Greece, the Royal Navy risked everything to pull the soldiers off the beaches. But for many, there would be no rescue. Over 12,000 Allied troops were left behind, forced to surrender and face years of captivity. The island of Crete had fallen, but the victory was so hollow that it felt like a defeat. When the final tallies were calculated, the German High Command was horrified. The Fallschirmjäger had suffered nearly 4,000 dead and missing in just 10 days of fighting. More elite paratroopers had been lost on Crete than in the entire war up to that point. Hitler, stunned by the carnage, famously told Kurt's student that the day of the parachute arm was over. He believed that the element of surprise had been lost forever and that airborne operations on such a scale would never again be viable. The irony of Crete is profound. The Germans won the island but lost the weapon that had won it for them. The Fallschirmjäger would spend the rest of the war fighting as elite infantry on the ground, their specialized training and vertical capability largely mothballed. Conversely, the Allies, despite their defeat, looked at the German operation and saw the future. They would take the lessons of the German failure and use them to build the massive airborne divisions that would eventually drop into Sicily, Normandy, and the Netherlands. The legacy of Crete is etched into the very stones of the island. It was a battle where the brilliance of the common soldier was overshadowed by the systemic failures of those in command. It was a testament to the fact that intelligence and technology are meaningless without the will to act decisively. The death of the paratroopers on Crete was the end of an era of German military innovation and the beginning of a much darker, more attritional phase of the war in the Mediterranean. The philosophical weight of this conflict lies in the transition from traditional warfare to the total, unbridled violence of the mid-century. Crete was the last moment where a small, elite force could dream of capturing an entire island through audacity alone. When the silk shoots finally rotted away in the Cretan sun, they left behind a world that had realized that the sky was no longer a sanctuary, but another front in the relentless machinery of modern destruction. As the sun sets over the military cemetery at Malum, the rows of grey crosses stand as silent witnesses to a gamble that failed even in its success. The mountains of Crete remain indifferent to the blood spilled in their passes, a rugged monument to the hubris of empires and the enduring spirit of those who defend their homes. The story of Crete is not one of triumph, but of a tragic, costly bridge between the old world of tactical maneuvers and the new world of industrial slaughter. The silk in the sky was a beautiful omen of a terrifying future.